Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, my name is Casey. Today, we're continuing Brand Spotlight, my mini-series where we look at fashion brands through a bigger lens. Not just what they sell, but where they came from, what made them stand out, and why some brands stay powerful while others lose their edge. There are few American fashion brands that made something as ordinary as a white t-shirt, a pair of jeans, or a sweatshirt feel culturally important. Gap did exactly that, especially in the 1990s. For decades, the brand represented a very recognizable idea of American style: casual, simple, approachable, and easy to make your own. But as fashion changed and competition grew, Gap seemed to lose some of that relevance. Now the brand is finding its way back into the fashion conversation. So what made Gap work in the first place? Why were the 90s so important to its identity? And can that same formula appeal to a new generation? How Gap started. Gap was founded in San Francisco in 1969 by Don and Doris Fisher. The original idea came from a simple problem. Don Fisher reportedly struggled to find jeans that fit, so the couple created a store offering Levi's in a wider range of sizes. The first Gap store also sold records and tapes, reflecting the younger audience it wanted to attract. Even the name came from the idea of the generation gap. Eventually, Gap began producing clothing under its own name and expanded beyond denim into t-shirts, sweatshirts, khakis, button-down shirts, sweaters, and outerwear. These familiar wardrobe pieces became the foundation of the brand. Gap was never really about making clothing look complicated. Its strength was making simple clothes feel current. The 90s, when Gap became culture. The 1990s were arguably Gap's defining decade. Fashion was moving between grunge, minimalism, preppy dressing, and supermodel glamour. But Gap managed to fit comfortably into all of them because its clothing was simple enough to adapt. Its advertising leaned into that simplicity. Clean studio photography, black and white portraits, white shirts, denim, and khakis became part of the brand's visual identity. In 1992, models wearing Gap pieces appeared on Vogue's 100th anniversary cover. The following year came the Who Wore Khakis campaign, connecting an everyday wardrobe staple with recognizable cultural figures. Then, in 1996, Sharon Stone famously wore a Gap mock turtleneck with a Valentino skirt and Armani coat to the Oscars. A relatively affordable basic was suddenly sitting comfortably beside luxury fashion. And in 1998, the khakis swing commercial turned another simple item into one of the brand's most memorable advertising moments. What made these campaigns work was that Gap rarely presented its clothes as a complete fashion identity. The pieces were simple enough for the person wearing them to provide the personality. Gap occupied an interesting middle ground. It was not luxury, but it was not simply about finding the cheapest clothing either. It offered dependable versions of pieces people already understood. Jeans, white shirts, sweaters, khakis, and t-shirts did not require much explanation. But Gap understood that basics still needed styling. The same white shirt could look polished, preppy, minimal, or relaxed depending on who wore it. Denim could move from casual to fashion-forward with only a change of shoes or jacket. That flexibility became one of Gap's strongest qualities. Rather than giving customers an entire personality to copy, Gap gave them a starting point. The clothes were recognizable, but they left room for individual style. When Gap lost some of its appeal. Eventually, though, basic clothing became much easier to find. Fast fashion retailers became quicker at responding to trends. Uniqlo developed its own strong identity around functional everyday clothing. Online shopping introduced consumers to hundreds of new brands. Gap remained recognizable, but its reason for being became less obvious. If every retailer sells jeans, sweatshirts, white shirts, and sweaters, why specifically choose Gap? For a brand built around familiar clothing, the challenge became staying familiar without becoming forgettable. And there were periods when Gap simply did not feel as culturally distinct as it had during its strongest years. The comeback. That is why the brand's current direction is interesting. Zach Posen joined Gap Incorporated as creative director in 2024, bringing a stronger fashion perspective while still working with the pieces Gap already understands. Gap Studio, launched in 2025, takes familiar ideas such as denim, shirting, and American sportswear and interprets them in a more elevated way. The brand has also collaborated with names including Doen, Sandy Liang, and Harlem's Fashion Row. Instead of abandoning Gap's basics, these collaborations show how differently those same pieces can be interpreted. The strategy also appears to be translating commercially. In the first quarter of 2026, Gap reported a 10% increase in comparable sales, suggesting that renewed interest in the brand is reaching beyond fashion headlines. Does Gap appeal to Gen Z? Perhaps the biggest opportunity for Gap is that its past happens to fit surprisingly well with what younger consumers are wearing now. Baggy denim, basic tanks, oversized shirts, sweatshirts, simple knits, and relaxed layering all have obvious connections to Gap's archive. In July 2026, Gap introduced the Hailey jean with Hailey Bieber, directly referencing vintage Gap denim and relaxed silhouettes from the 1990s. For Gen Z, those references are not necessarily nostalgic in the same way they are for someone who lived through that decade. They can simply feel like fashion. And younger shoppers are giving these familiar clothes different styling. An oversized button down might be worn with loose denim rather than khakis. A Gap sweatshirt might appear with a long skirt, loafers, or sneakers. Vintage looking jeans might be paired with a fitted tank and oversized jacket. The clothes themselves are not necessarily new. The context around them is. That gives Gap an advantage. It does not need to completely reinvent itself to participate in current fashion. It already has decades of denim, sportswear, and everyday basics to work with. But nostalgia alone cannot carry Gap forever. The real opportunity is remembering why the brand worked so well in the first place. The clothes were useful, adaptable, and simple enough to wear repeatedly. Strong imagery and clever styling made those ordinary pieces feel culturally relevant. At its best, Gap does not tell you exactly who to be. It gives you familiar clothes and enough room to make them your own. And maybe that is why the brand has another opportunity now. In a fashion landscape filled with constantly changing aesthetics and microtrends, Gap's original idea suddenly feels surprisingly current again. Good basics, good denim, strong styling, and plenty of room for personal style. If there's another brand you want me to feature next in this series, let me know below. Thank you again for spending time with me, and see you in the next one.